Thunderbolts.info podcast for November 24th, 2012. We bring you all the latest news, information, and analysis from the electric universe, shedding new light on the many mysteries that dark theories have yet to I'm very excited about the program we have in store for you today. In fact, I'm not just excited, I have nervous anticipation. Many followers of the Thunderbolts Project have become aware. Welcome to the Thunderbolts.info podcast for November 24th, 2012. We bring you all the latest news, information, and analysis from the electric universe, shedding new light on the many mysteries that dark theories have yet to illuminate. I'm very excited about the program we have in store for you today. In fact, I'm not just excited, I have nervous anticipation. Many followers of the Thunderbolts Project have become aware in recent years of the work of a gentleman by the name of Stephen J. Crothers. And Stephen Crothers has presented a challenge to the scientific dogmas that have arisen in the last century surrounding Einstein's theory of general relativity and black holes. In fact, the very existence of black holes is now being questioned by Stephen J. Crothers, and more people around the globe The Thunderbolts.info podcast for November 24th, 2012. We bring you all the latest news, information, and analysis from the electric universe. Einstein's theory of general relativity. I have nervous anticipation. Many followers of the Thunderbolts project have become aware in recent years of the work of a gentleman by the name of Stephen J. Crothers. And Stephen Crothers has presented a challenge to the scientific dogmas that have arisen in the last century surrounding Einstein's theory of general relativity and black holes. In fact, the very existence of black holes is now being questioned by Stephen J. Crothers and more people around the globe, including many qualified scientists in different disciplines, not just mathematics, are taking a deep interest in Stephen Crothers' challenge. The presentation that we are offering you here today is the most challenging and technical presentation that we have offered to date on the Thunderbolts YouTube channel. I myself am a layperson, and yet our feeling is that there are basic ideas and principles that can be understood at a purely common sense level. So I'm going to bring Stephen on to the show now. And first of all, Stephen, thank you very much for being here today. I am very excited, as I said, about our discussion. Why don't you begin by telling the listeners a little bit about your background in terms of your interests and your academic training?
My name's Steve Crothers. I hold qualifications in philosophy, an undergraduate degree, postgraduate certificate in science in pure mathematics, a postgraduate diploma in technology, postgraduate certificate in engineering, and finally a master's degree in astronomy. I worked for about 12 years as a sessional teacher at colleges and universities, and prior to that I had nothing to do with academia. I went into research at the age of 47, currently 55, and I specialised in mathematical analysis of general relativity.
Very good. Now, before we get into the meat of the discussion here, I'd like for you to tell the audience a little bit about a controversy that has been brewing behind the scenes over your challenge to the scientific establishment on the question of black holes and relativity. The way that these issues are presented in mainstream scientific media, the public is not really made aware that any such controversies exist. These issues are kind of presented as though they're essentially settled. So why don't you tell the audience about the response you have received when you have confronted members of the so-called establishment with your evidence?
Generally speaking, the response from the establishment has been negative. They tend to, in my experience, resist any argument at all that questions the authority of Einstein or the theories that they've established on the basis of general relativity or allegedly on the basis of general relativity. And so my experience has been very, very poor with them. Indeed, when I was a PhD candidate at the University of New South Wales in the School of Physics, when I was studying astrophysics and astronomy, after about 2 years into that program, which I was doing part-time, I came into somewhat of a clash with the professors at the university on the theoretical issues surrounding general relativity, and it developed into a rather acrimonious situation, which ultimately culminated in me being expelled from the university for simply doing nothing other than challenging the currently accepted paradigm in relation to the nature of the universe being interpreted in terms of space-time, four-dimensional space-time, and Einstein's conception of the gravitational field. So it's been from the outside area that my work has been pursued by people, and I find a growing ground of support, and I think a quite legitimate one, because the arguments that underlie the foundations of general relativity show that it can't really hold up as a well-established physical theory. So that's about the size of the situation, but there is, I believe, a growing interest in the problems associated with general relativity, because so many things have had to be constructed ad hoc to salvage the theory. Unfortunately, my feeling is that it can't be salvaged for various reasons, as we'll see, and some new ideas as to the structure of the universe are necessary.
Stephen, thank you for that background story. I did not know your personal story, but I guess the details that you're giving are not a terrible surprise to me or probably to anyone in the Thunderbolts group. Now, let's move on now to the issue of the 5 proofs that you will be offering in our discussion today. For full disclosure, I'd just like to let the audience know that I did specifically request your assistance leading up to this interview in formulating the appropriate questions. Most of the issues we're talking about today are well outside my own comfort and familiarity. So if I at any point misstate something or you'd like to offer clarification, please feel free to correct me wherever is appropriate. Now, my first question is, it's my understanding that within an Einsteinian frame, matter is not the cause of a gravitational field, because gravity is not a force, but is due to a curvature in his space-time induced by the presence of matter. But isn't it true that based on the principle of general relativity, the universe contains no matter whatsoever? No stars, no planets, no galaxies, let alone neutron stars, black holes, and the like. In fact, in this purely mathematical model, even atoms and subatomic particles are removed, so that consequently is physically meaningless. Is this not so?
Yes, but I'll qualify that. Einstein's field equations were reduced by Einstein to a set of equations where he sets the Ricci tensor to 0, which I'll refer to as Ric, R-I-C equals 0. In this instance, this does meet all the points that you made, that it is actually an empty universe. So in regards to that, yes, indeed, this is true, although it is disguised by meaningless play on the words first used by Einstein and reiterated by his followers. But before I answer this question, let me say something more about the causal connection between space-time and matter in general relativity. In their book, An Introduction to Modern Astrophysics, Carroll and Ostley say that mass acts on space-time, telling it how to curve. Space-time, in turn, acts on mass, telling it how to move. In their book, A Short Course in General Relativity, Foster and Nightingale state that Einstein's field equations couple the gravitational field contained in the curvature of space-time with its sources. Hence, in short, we have a simple relation: space-time geometry equals minus kappa times causative matter, that is sources, where kappa is merely a coupling constant. Now, mathematically, this is expressed by Einstein's field equations as capital G sub uv is equal to minus kappa capital T sub uv. Now, capital G sub uv is called the Einstein tensor, and it denotes the geometry and curvature of space-time, that is Einstein's alleged gravitational field. The Greek letter kappa, as I said, is merely a coupling constant, and the capital T sub uv is called the energy momentum tensor, and it describes the sources of the gravitational field, that is the matter that causes the curvature of space-time geometry and hence the gravitational field. The subscripts U and V take the values 0, 1, 2, 3. We should also note at this point that solutions to Einstein's field equations are given in terms of what is called a metric or line element. These two terms are nothing but fancy names for a distance formula, by which the distance between 2 points in the Minkowski-Einstein four-dimensional space-time can be allegedly calculated. We are now in a position to answer your question and to thereby consider the first argument I present for the non-existence of the black hole via Einstein's argument for the field equations for his so-called static vacuum field, from which the so-called Schwarzschild solution was obtained by David Hilbert in December 1916, and from which the black hole was spawned. Hilbert's solution is a corruption of Schwarzschild's solution, obtained in December 1915 and published in January 1916, and also of the equivalent of Schwarzschild's solution found independently by Johannes Druster in May 1916, published in 1917, neither of which, I might add, contains the black hole. Now, according to Einstein, if the energy momentum tensor is 0, then his field equations allegedly reduce to Ric equals R sub uv equals 0 for empty space, the so-called static vacuum field, since in this case the Einstein tensor reduces from G sub uv to capital R sub uv, where, as I mentioned, R sub uv is the Ricci tensor. Now, we note that by setting the energy momentum tensor to 0, Einstein has removed all matter and hence all sources from his field equations by the very definition of the energy momentum tensor. Therefore, Ric equals 0 describes a universe that actually contains no matter and hence no sources. and so there can be no black hole, since the alleged mass of a black hole is a source for an associated gravitational field. Indeed, we note that according to the Dictionary of Geophysics, Astrophysics and Astronomy, black holes were first discovered as purely mathematical solutions of Einstein's field equation. This solution, the Schwarzschild black hole, is a nonlinear solution of the Einstein equations of general relativity. It contains no matter and exists forever in an asymptotically flat space-time. Now, a universe that contains no matter contains no gravitational field and does not model the actual universe, since the actual universe contains lots of matter and gravitational fields. Thus, Rick equals zero has no physical meaning, contrary to Einstein's claims and those of his followers. You see, Einstein removes all matter and hence all sources by writing Rick equals zero as a result of setting the energy momentum tensor to zero. And in the next breath, he says Rick equals zero describes the field outside a body, such as a star, where the components of the energy momentum tensor vanish. Since matter is still the source of Einstein's gravitational field, when one asks Einstein, then what is the source of this alleged gravitational field outside a body such as a star, he tells us that it is the body outside of which the gravitational field exists. Indeed, in his book, The Meaning of Relativity, Einstein says in relation to Hilbert's metric that M denotes the sun's mass, centrally, symmetrically placed about the origin of coordinates. Now, I point out that this is a circular reasoning and therefore invalid, remembering that he has already removed all matter and hence all sources by the very writing of Rick equals zero. Einstein cannot remove all matter and hence all sources on the one hand by writing Rick equals zero, and then in the next breath insert the notion of a source being present with the misleading words outside a body, because there is no body present for anything to be outside of by virtue of the energy momentum tensor being set to zero. His argument violates elementary logic and is therefore false. Nothing but a subtle play on the words outside a body. Thus, Rick equals zero is physically meaningless. Now, since Rick equals zero has no physical meaning, Hilbert's solution has no physical meaning either, and so it cannot contain mass and hence a black hole. The same holds for Schwarzschild's actual solution as well, and Drewster's equivalent solution. Thus, there is no such thing as a black hole. The black hole is not predicted by general relativity at all. This argument is sufficient to invalidate the concept of the black hole completely. Indeed, any of the arguments I will give stand alone as proofs that the black hole is fallacious.
Stephen, that's very good, and it's actually amazing to me that a layperson like myself can find your discussion as compelling, considering that I have no training whatsoever in mathematics. Now let's move on to question number 2. Einstein's theory of general relativity includes the principle of equivalence. How does the principle of equivalence relate to the alleged existence of black holes? And does this principle require the a priori presence of multiple masses?
In his book, The Meaning of Relativity, Einstein asserted that his principle of equivalence and his laws of special relativity must hold in sufficiently small, finite regions of his gravitational field, and that these regions can be located anywhere in his gravitational field. Now, we know that both the principle of equivalence and special relativity are defined by Einstein in terms of the a priori presence of multiple, arbitrarily large, finite masses and photons. It is therefore impossible for the principle of equivalence and special relativity to manifest in a space-time that by mathematical construction contains no matter. But Rick equals zero is a space-time that by mathematical construction contains no matter. Indeed, in the Dictionary of Geophysics, Astrophysics and Astronomy, we find the following remark. Black holes were first discovered as purely mathematical solutions of Einstein's field equations. This solution, the Schwarzschild black hole, is a nonlinear solution of the Einstein equations of general relativity. It contains no matter and exists forever in an asymptotically flat space-time. Thus, Rick equals zero violates the physical principles of general relativity, and so it is inadmissible and therefore has no physical significance. Since Hilbert's solution is for Rick equals zero, it is also of no physical significance, because it is a solution for a space-time that by mathematical construction contains no matter. But it is from Hilbert's metric that the black hole was first conjured. Therefore, the black hole is not consistent with general relativity at all. General relativity does not predict a black hole, since a black hole is a theoretical entity first obtained from Hilbert's solution. The black hole does not exist.
Let's move on to question number 3. The principle of superposition is a well-known property of linear systems in physics. Does Einstein's general theory of relativity adhere to this basic principle?
The answer is an emphatic no. Principle of superposition does not apply in general relativity, since Einstein's field equations are highly nonlinear, because when we attempt to solve his field equations for some supposed configuration of matter,
and remember, that's what we see observationally out there, and it's exactly not that.
we are confronted with a set of nonlinear partial differential equations. Mathematically, this simply means that if x and y are separate solutions to the field equations, then the linear combination ax plus by, where a and b are scalars, is not a solution. Physically, this means that one cannot pile up matter into any given space-time, that is, into any solution to Einstein's field equations, to obtain additional masses, charges, photons, and electromagnetic field as desired. But that is exactly what Einstein and his followers actually do as a matter of routine. We should also note that in section 14 of his original paper, The Foundation of the General Theory of Relativity, published in 1916, Einstein asserted that matter consists of mass and of the electromagnetic field, and all this contributes to his gravitational field, even though there is not one iota of experimental evidence to suggest that electromagnetic fields and charges contribute to gravitation. Charge is implicitly included because electromagnetic fields cannot be present without charges in motion to produce them. Hence, charge is included in the so-called Rosen-Nordström metric for a charged black hole, allegedly obtained from an energy momentum tensor that contains terms for a pure electric field and no mass term to carry the charge for the electric field, bearing in mind that there can be no charge without mass. One cannot simply pile up masses and photons and charges and electromagnetic fields in any given space-time, because each and every proposed configuration of matter must be described by a corresponding energy momentum tensor, and Einstein's field equation solved separately for that energy momentum tensor. Now, Rick equals 0 is a space-time that by mathematical construction contains no matter, and so a Hilbert solution describes a universe that contains no matter. But the actual universe, as we've noted previously, contains a lot of matter. And since the principle of that position does not apply in general relativity, one cannot insert matter into the space-time of Rick equals 0, and hence neither into Hilbert's associated solution to get any number of masses as one pleases. Thus, there can be no black hole in Hilbert's solution, and there is no black hole in the space-time of Rick equals 0 by the very definition of Rick equals 0. Thus, the black hole does not exist. But it is claimed that the black hole is contained in Hilbert's solution by Einstein's follows. This is clearly impossible. Now, let us assume, for the sake of argument, that Rick equals 0 actually contains one mass, as Einstein falsely claimed, so that Hilbert's solution then describes a universe that contains only one mass. Thus, the relevant space-time is infinite and totally empty, save for the presence of the mass of the alleged black hole. There is no meaning to a gravitational field outside the said mass in a universe that contains only that one mass. All experiments show that gravitation is an interaction between masses. Now, neither the principle of equivalence nor special relativity can manifest in a space-time that allegedly, by mathematical construction, contains only one mass. And since the principle of superposition does not apply in general relativity, one cannot simply pile up photons, masses, and charges and electromagnetic fields in the space-time of Rick equals 0 described by Hilbert's solution in order to obtain multiple masses, be they other black holes or other matter for the black holes to devour, or to have charged masses or electromagnetic radiation outside the alleged Hilbert black hole. Hence, Rick equals 0 and Hilbert's solution violate the physical principles of general relativity and are therefore once again inadmissible. Moreover, all alleged solutions to Einstein's field equations for a black hole pertain to an infinite universe that contains only one isolated mass, be it a Schwarzschild black hole, that is a Hilbert black hole, be it a charged black hole, that is the Rosen-Nordström black hole, be it a rotating black hole, that is the Kerr black hole, or be it the charged and rotating black hole, that is the Kerr-Newman black hole. In all cases, the principle of superposition does not apply in general relativity, and since there are no known solutions to Einstein's field equations for two or more masses, and no existence theorem by which it can even be asserted that his field equations contain latent solutions for two or more masses, one cannot pile up additional masses and photons and charges and electromagnetic fields into the space-time of any of these alleged types of black hole. Hence, the principle of equivalence and special relativity cannot manifest in the space-time associated with any of the types of black hole alleged, so they all violate the physical principles of general relativity. Thus, none can describe the actual universe. It is therefore also utter nonsense to assert that black holes can exist in multitudes and interact with one another, be located at the centers of galaxies, collide or merge with one another, be components of binary systems, or exist with other matter that they can swallow and digest, despite the almost daily claims for the discovery of multiple black holes in the universe and black holes and other matter in the universe. Indeed, NASA recently posted a report to the World Wide Web that its people have discovered 2.5 million black holes. The claim is just plain poppycock. In addition, since general relativity has only solutions for one mass, be they solutions cosmological or otherwise, general relativity cannot account for the well-established experimental fact that two fixed suspended bodies will approach one another upon release.
All right, now we move on to question number 4. Is it true that Newton's expression for escape velocity appears in Hilbert's metric by means of a false analogy with Newton's theory, and that division by zero is permitted therein in violation of elementary mathematics?
Yes, this is indeed true. In Hilbert's metric, with the speed of light c in vacuum and Newton's gravitational constant g written explicitly instead of the usual deceptive form where c and g are set to unity, the following two terms appear. G sub 00 equals 1 minus 2gm over c squared r. G sub 11 equals minus 1 over 1 minus 2gm over c squared r, where, according to the proponents of the black hole, the range of r is 0, is less than or equal to r, is less than infinity. The quantity r has never been properly identified by the relativists, including Einstein himself. It has been variously and vaguely called a distance, the radius of a two-sphere, the coordinate radius, the radial coordinate, the Schwarzschild R coordinate, the radial space coordinate, the areal radius, the reduced circumference, the shortest distance to the center, and even a gauge choice. It defines the coordinate r. In the particular case of r equals 2gm over c squared, it is invariably called the Schwarzschild radius, or the gravitational radius, for the radius of the event horizon of the black hole. In his paper on a stationary system with spherical symmetry consisting of many gravitating masses, published in October 1939, Einstein uses the Hilbert metric, written in the so-called isotropic coordinates, and continually and incorrectly refers to r as the radius. This large number of different definitions of r attests to utter confusion amongst Einstein and his followers. Clearly, neither Einstein nor his followers know what the quantity r is in Hilbert's metric. Now, none of the foregoing various and vague concepts of r are correct, because the irrefutable fact is that r, in Hilbert's version of the Schwarzschild and Brewster solutions, is the inverse square root of the Gaussian curvature of the spherically symmetric geodesic surface in the spatial section, which is easily proved by calculation. And so it does not denote any distance at all in Hilbert's metric, and so it cannot ever be treated as a radius or a distance in Hilbert's solution, contrary to the practice of Einstein and his followers. Now, by incorrectly treating r as the radius, the proponents of the black hole that say that when r equals 2gm over c squared, the term g sub 11 equals minus 1 over 1 minus 2gm over c squared r in the Hilbert solution is singular, because this term, they say, is then infinite. This is false, because singular is a deceptive term that really means undefined by virtue of the fact that at r equals 2gm over c squared, the term g sub 11 equals minus 1 over 0, and so involves division by 0, which is undefined, as any high school student knows. Nonetheless, the proponents of the black hole permit division by 0, and in this case, they call r equals 2gm over c squared the Schwarzschild radius or gravitational radius of a black hole. That is, the radius of the event horizon of a black hole. But as we have also seen, r is neither a distance nor a radius in Hilbert's solution. So the claim is, again, patently false. Then they say that at r equals 0, the term G sub 00 equals 1 minus 2 GM over 0 is singular, and that is then infinite and negative. And the term G sub 11 equals minus 1 over 1 minus 2 GM over 0 is 0. This again actually means that the solution is undefined at R equals 0, because the term 2 GM over 0 is undefined since it involves division by 0. Thus, the proponents of the black hole permit division by 0 twice when R equals 0. Thus, they violate elementary mathematics once again, and so the black hole is false. Furthermore, at R equals 0, they claim that there is an infinitely dense point mass singularity, but special relativity forbids infinite density, and hence general relativity also forbids infinite density. Essentially, you will recall that according to Einstein, his laws of special relativity must hold in sufficiently small finite regions of its gravitational field. Now, the infinitely dense point mass singularity is an oxymoron, because a point is a mathematical entity that by definition has no extension, but a mass is not a point since it is not a mathematical entity, but a physical entity that thereby necessarily has extension. Yet the proponents of the black hole nonsensically claim that there is an infinitely dense point mass singularity for the black hole at R equals 0 in Hilbert's solution. In his book, Theory of Everything, The Origin and Fate of the Universe, Stephen Hawking says, the work that Roger Penrose and I did between 1965 and 1970 showed that according to general relativity, there must be a singularity of infinite density within the black hole. In their book, Tensor Geometry, The Geometric Viewpoint and Its Uses, Dodson and Poston say once a body of matter of any mass m lies within its Schwarzschild radius 2m, it undergoes gravitational collapse and the singularity becomes physical, not a limiting fiction. In their book, An Introduction to Modern Astrophysics, Cale and Ostley say a non-rotating black hole has a particularly simple structure. At the center is the singularity, a point of 0 volume and infinite density where all of the black hole's mass is located. Space-time is infinitely curved at the singularity. The black hole singularity is a real physical entity. It is not a mathematical artifact. These claims are patently false because there can be no infinite density anywhere in Einstein's gravitational field, no matter howsoever it is alleged to have occurred, because infinite density cannot be reconciled with the special relativity. Hence, the black hole is again false. It is also important to note that infinite dense point mass singularities occur in Newtonian mechanics, where they are called centers of mass, which are merely logical fictions or mathematical artifice, not real objects, as any engineer knows. Yet the proponents of the black hole, as we have seen, claim that they are real physical entities. Now, one can go to the shop and buy a bag of marble, but if one went to the shop and asked to buy a bag full of centers of masses, the shopkeeper would rightly think that his customer was rather odd, to say the least. So we might well ask, where does that leave the proponents of the black hole? In addition, solving the so-called Schwarzschild radius term R equals 2gm over c squared for c, we get c is equal to the square root of 2gm over r, which we immediately recognize as Newton's expression for escape velocity. Thus, at the so-called Schwarzschild radius, the proponents of the black hole claim that the escape velocity of a black hole is the speed c of light in vacuum. But Newton's expression for escape velocity is an implicit two-body relation. One body escapes from another body, and so it cannot rightly appear in an expression that allegedly describes a universe that contains only one body, but which is in actual fact an expression that describes a universe that contains no matter at all by virtue of Rick equals 0. Newton's expression for escape velocity appears in Hilbert's metric by means of an invalid analogy with Newton's theory. Note also that in Newton's expression for escape velocity, the quantity r is an actual radius, but this is not the case in Hilbert's metric. Indeed, it is not the case in any alleged black hole solutions to Einstein's field equation. Yet despite this irrefutable fact, the relativists always treat r as the radius in all alleged black hole metrics, and so their conclusions are all totally false. The proponents of the black hole claim on one hand that the escape velocity of a black hole is the speed of light c in vacuum. By virtue of the Newtonian expression for escape velocity, c is equal to the square root of 2gm over r. star in Hilbert's metric. But if that is so, then by the very definition of escape velocity, light can escape from the black hole. However, the very same scientists also claim, on the other hand, that nothing, including light, can even leave a black hole. This is a contradiction, and so the arguments are patently false. Nothing but a subtle play on the word escape velocity. Indeed, according to Chandrasekhar, in his paper, The Increasing Role of General Relativity in Astronomy, he says, let me be more precise as to what one means by a black hole. One says that a black hole is formed when the gravitational forces of the surface become so strong that light cannot escape from it. A trapped surface is one from which light cannot escape to infinity. The problem we now consider is that of the gravitational collapse of a body to a volume so small that a trapped surface forms around it. As we have stated, from such a surface, no light can emerge. In his book, The Theory of Everything, The Origin and Fate of the Universe, Hawking says, I had already discussed with Roger Penrose the idea of defining a black hole as a set of events from which it is not possible to escape to a large distance. It means that the boundary of the black hole, the event horizon, is formed by rays of light that just fail to get away from the black hole. Instead, they stay forever hovering on the edge of the black hole. Taylor and Wheeler, in their book Exploring Black Holes, Introduction to General Relativity, assert that Einstein predicts that nothing, not even light, can be successfully launched outward from the horizon, and that light launched outward exactly at the horizon will never increase its radial position by so much as a millimeter. Thus, the notion of black hole escape velocity is meaningless, and owing to the contradiction in relation thereto, the black hole again does not exist. Notice also that Einstein's followers say that there are two singularities in Hilbert's solution, one at r equals 2gm over c squared and one at r equals 0. They say that r equals 2gm over c squared denotes a coordinate singularity or removable singularity, which they remove by means of the complicated Kruskal-Sakaris coordinate, since they incorrectly treat r in Hilbert's solution as the radius, but they nevertheless retain it as the alleged radius of the event horizon of a black hole, thereby committing another contradiction by which the black hole is invalidated yet again.
Okay, now folks, I'm going to briefly interject one point here. If there are any students watching this, students who have entered college or university, and they are studying many of the subjects that Stephen Crothers is addressing here today, irrespective of how you might feel about the correctness of his conclusions, and regardless of whether you even fully comprehend everything that he's talking about, my invitation to you is to please consider sending this presentation to your professors and to directly challenge them to try and repudiate the points that Stephen is making here today. Now we move on to question number 5, and this is our final question today. Is the theoretical Michel-Laplace dark body associated with Newton's theory of a black hole?
Absolutely not. Although it is routinely asserted that the theoretical Michel-Laplace dark body of Newton's theory, which has an escape velocity greater than or equal to c, is a kind of black hole, or that Newton's theory somehow predicts, for example, to Taylor and Wheeler in their book Exploring Black Holes, Introduction to General Relativity, the radius of a black hole, Hawking remarks in his book, The Theory of Everything, The Origin and Fate of the Universe. On this assumption, a Cambridge Don, John Michell, wrote a paper in 1783 in the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society of London. In it, he pointed out that a star that was sufficiently massive and compact would have such a strong gravitational field that light could not escape. Any light emitted from the surface of the star would be dragged back by the star's gravitational attraction before it could get very far. Michel suggested that there might be a large number of stars like this, although we would not be able to see them because light from them would not reach us. We could still feel their gravitational attraction. Such objects are what we now call black holes, because that is what they are, black voids in space. In the Cambridge Illustrated History of Astronomy, it is asserted that 18th century speculators had discussed the characteristics of stars so dense that light would be prevented from leaving them by the strength of their gravitational attraction. And according to Einstein's general relativity, such bizarre objects, today's black holes, were theoretically possible as end products of stellar evolution, provided the stars were massive enough for the inward gravitational attraction to overwhelm the repulsive forces at work. In their paper, Astrophysical Evidence for the Existence of Black Holes, Solotti, Miller, and Skiyama say In his famous article of 1784, which is seen as being the beginning of the story of black holes, John Michell wrote, "If there should really exist in nature any such body, we could have no information from sight. Yet, if any other luminous bodies should happen to revolve around them, we might still perhaps, from the motions of these revolving bodies, infer the existence of the central ones with some degree of probability, as this might afford a clue to some of the apparent irregularities of the revolving bodies, which would not be easily explicable on any other hypothesis." There, at the very beginning, the theoretically predicted properties of Newtonian black holes were discussed, together with a carefully worded statement about how it might be determined observationally whether such objects do in fact exist. In the Dictionary of Geophysics, Astrophysics and Astronomy, one finds the following assertions. Black hole, a region of space-time from which the escape velocity exceeds the velocity of light. In Newtonian gravity, the escape velocity from the gravitational pull of a spherical star of mass m and radius r is v sub escape equals the square root of 2gm over r, where g is Newton's constant. Adding mass to the star, increasing m, or compressing the star, reducing r, increases v sub escape. When the escape velocity exceeds the speed of light, even light cannot escape, and the star becomes a black hole. The required radius r sub bh follows from setting v escape equal to c. R sub bh equals 2gm over c squared. In general relativity, for spherical black holes, Schwarzschild black holes, exactly the same expression r sub bh holds for the surface of a black hole. The surface of a black hole at r sub bh is a null surface, consisting of those photon trajectories, null rays, which just do not escape to infinity. This surface is also called the black hole horizon. According to Chandrasekhar in his paper, The Increasing Role of General Relativity in Astronomy, that such a contingency can arise was surmised already by Laplace in 1798. Laplace argued as follows. For a particle to escape from the surface of a spherical body of mass m and radius r, it must be projected with a velocity v, such that a half v squared is greater than gm over r, and it cannot escape if v squared is less than 2gm over r. On the basis of this last inequality, Laplace concluded that if r is less than 2gm over c squared equals r sub s, say, where c denotes the velocity of light, then light will not be able to escape from such a body, and we will not be able to see it. By a curious coincidence, the limit r sub s discovered by Laplace is exactly the same that general relativity gives for the occurrence of the trapped surface around a spherical mass. Now, I know that it is not surprising that general relativity gives the same r sub s discovered by Laplace, because the Newtonian expression for escape velocity is deliberately and inadmissibly inserted post hoc by the relativist into Hilbert's metric in order to make it so. Newton's escape velocity does not drop out of any of the calculations to Hilbert's metric. Furthermore, although Rick equals 0 is claimed to describe space-time outside a body, Hilbert's metric is nonetheless used to describe the interior of a black hole as well, since a black hole begins at the alleged event horizon, not at its infinitely dense point mass singularity, said to be at r equals 0 in Hilbert's solution. We therefore see that the expression r equals 2gm over c squared is the radius at which light can escape from the theoretical Michel-Laplace dark body associated with Newton's theory, not the Schwarzschild radius of a black hole, and has nothing to do with the alleged black hole whatsoever. If r is less than 2gm over c squared, then the escape velocity of the Michel-Laplace dark body is greater than c for a fixed mass m, and so light cannot escape from it, but that does not mean that light cannot leave it. Now, the Michel-Laplace dark body is not a black hole. The Michel-Laplace dark body possesses an escape velocity, whereas the black hole has no escape velocity. Objects can leave the Michel-Laplace dark body, but nothing can leave the black hole. There is no upper limit of the speed of a body in Newton's theory, so masses can always escape from the Michel-Laplace dark body, provided they leave at or greater than the escape velocity. The Michel-Laplace dark body does not require irresistible gravitational collapse, whereas the black hole does. It has no infinitely dense point mass singularity, whereas the black hole does. It has no event horizon, whereas the black hole does. There is always a class of observers that can see the Michel-Laplace dark dark body, but there is no class of observers that can see the black hole. The Michel-Laplace dark body can persist in a space which contains other matter, including Michel-Laplace dark bodies, and interact with that matter, but the space-time of the alleged black hole is devoid of other masses by mathematical construction, and consequently cannot interact with anything. Thus, the Michel-Laplace dark body does not possess the signatures of the alleged black hole, and so it is not a black hole. From the foregoing analysis, we can conclude without any doubt that the black hole is not predicted by general relativity or by Newton's theory in any form whatsoever. And since a black hole is allegedly a theoretical entity predicted by general relativity, we can conclude that the black hole does not exist. It is therefore no wonder that nobody has ever found a black hole anywhere, despite the almost daily claims for black holes being found all over the place. The search for black holes has always been destined to detect nothing. Finally, it can be easily proven that general relativity violates the usual conservation of energy and momentum and is therefore in conflict with experiment on a very deep level. Thus, the black hole is again invalidated, as is the Big Bang cosmology with its expansion of the universe and Einstein's gravitational waves. I will not present this proof now, as it involves some mathematical calculations involving tensor quantities and Einstein's demonstrably invalid pseudo-tensor.
Stephen, this was an amazing thing for me to participate in here today. I've never taken part in anything like this before, and I'm really looking forward to see the kind of debate that is stirred up by this presentation. My hope is that this will be a permanent resource that will be a source of discussion and argument among people who have devoted their lives to studying these questions. And we're very excited about having you as a featured speaker coming up at the Thunderbolts Conference in Albuquerque in January 2000.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased to be invited to be able to address you today on matters concerning general relativity and the non-existence of the black hole. It's also a subject, of course, that's fascinated many people, but it really doesn't have any real sound basis in any science, neither in general relativity or Newtonian theory. So before I get started on it, I'd just like to go over, make a few little comments about these black holes, because there's been some developments in recent times. Like, these black holes seem to be reproducing like rabbits. What we get is, let's go quickly through a whole list of things that we have with black holes. We start off with micro black holes, mini black holes, intermediate black holes, what we might call a regular black hole. Then we've got supermassive black holes. Now, recently, they've been talking about ultra supermassive black holes. And I'm waiting with bated breath for the next one. Maybe it'll be a mega ultra supermassive black hole. Well, the proponents of the black hole seem to just add adjectives and think that that makes it, gives it a more scientific validity. Well, adjectives don't do that. That's linguistics, it's not science. So I don't think that that's going to help them. The other thing is, of course, we're starting to get lots of reports of photographs on the internet and in journals and so forth and things. And you get things like, see that part you can't see? Yeah, it's a black hole. The other thing is, see all of those shiny things that shine brighter than stars? Those quasars? Yeah, well, they're black holes too. So we now get reports, for example, on quasar 3C279, which is reported as being a black hole. Well, as the previous speaker pointed out, Alton Arp has been speaking about quasar ejections. So what do we got now? Black holes ejecting, being ejected from what? These black holes are supposed to be sucking up things, digesting matter and gobbling up the universe. Of course, and then we have white holes. They do the opposite. Instead of gobbling up black holes, they vomit matter back into the universe. So, and then we've got wormholes, another whole thing, whatever they are. Anyway, so we see that there's some very dubious ideas here. And what I'd like to do is to give you a number of proofs that black holes are not predicted by general relativity at all. That's the first thing. They're not produced by by Newton's theory, contrary to what is claimed by proponents of the black hole, because it doesn't have the signatures of a black hole. And I'll see that, I'll show you that. And so there are other proofs that I could give, but I've tried to limit myself to those proofs that don't require much in the way of mathematics, because I don't want to bamboozle anybody with the hocus pocus of tensor analysis and differential geometry, that Einstein and his followers have been hiding behind for nearly 100 years, confuse everybody, and then say, we can't talk to you people, you don't know how to do sums. So what we'll do is now we'll move on to perhaps the first proof. Now, I'll read it to you, of course. Einstein's field equations couple the gravitational field contained in the curvature of space-time with its sources. I've given there a citation there from a source of this comment. And we can reduce this to some simple words where we have space-time geometry equals minus kappa times causative matter, that is sources. Well, kappa is nothing other than a coupling constant, so that's no big deal. Space-time geometry and causative matter. Well, we go to the next line and we see this is the mathematical form of it. This is a tensor equation. There's nothing frightening about this. People go into an apoplectic fit when they see a tensor equation and think, oh, I'm out of my depth. Well, that's not true. When we break this down, you'll see that you will not need to know anything about tensor analysis, have no need to be able to make a calculation in tensor analysis, and not really know much about or anything about differential geometry to be able to follow the arguments that I'm now going to present to you. So the words space-time geometry equals kappa times causative matter are reduced to this simple expression where G sub UV is called the Einstein tensor, and it describes space-time geometry, the curvature of space-time, which Einstein says is the gravitational field. Now, we see that this is a relationship between the curvature and the causative matter. So space-time and its curvature, the so-called gravitational field, is coupled to its sources. So there is a causal link between space-time and material causes. These subscripts here take on the values of 0, 1, 2, 3. They add a little bit of complication to it, but they're not frightening. Now, there's some simple terminology that I would like to use because you'll come across this as we go along, is that if we have a tensor T with subscripts, it's just called a covariant tensor. If it's a tensor with superscripts, it's called a covariant tensor. And if it's a tensor with superscripts and subscripts, it's called a mixed tensor. There's nothing difficult about that. The final thing that we have is the order of a tensor is equal to the number of suffixes. Well, when we look at the equations up here, we see that Einstein's field equations are second order tensors because they're two subscripts, U and V. That's it. Okay. Now, we come to Einstein's so-called field equations from which the black hole is derived. And Einstein says that if T sub UV equals 0, his G sub UV reduces to R sub UV for empty space outside a body. And R sub UV is called the Ricci tensor. So I've written it as Ric, which is not that often used, but is sometimes used in the literature. So Ric equals 0 is supposedly a set of field equations that describe the gravitational field outside a body. Well, so we ask now, what then is the source of the gravitational field outside a body? Bearing in mind that he's already removed all the sources by setting the energy momentum tensor to naught. So he's taken out all the matter that causes the gravitational field with one hand, and then he uses the words outside a body to re-put in, or to put back in, the very notion that there's a source present. Sure. So this is a bit of linguistic mumbo jumbo. What you've got now is no matter, but an object present. It's a contradiction. In fact, if we ask Einstein, what's the relation to Hilbert's solution for Ric equals 0? He says M denotes the source, or M denotes the sun's mass centrally, symmetrically placed about the origin of coordinates. So the introduction of mass here is done by some sort of surreptitious linguistic method. We've taken it out and put it in with another idea. It's a circular argument. And so this idea that Ric equals 0 actually is quite meaningless. Now, as I said here, it's a subtle play on the words outside a body. Well, so it's meaningless. It contains no matter because that's what the meaning of the energy momentum tensor is. That's the matter part. Well, if it's gone, you've got no matter. So what have we got here? A set of equations that describes a totally empty universe. Well, that doesn't describe anything. You look into the sky and what do you see? It's not empty. Now, there's one other point I'd like to make, as you see on the bottom here, is that the black hole was obtained from a Hilbert solution. David Hilbert was a German mathematician, and he was working contemporaneously with Einstein, and he came up with the field equations, same as Einstein, evidently shortly before Einstein, but that is not commonly known. But it is not Schwarzschild solution, even though it goes by Schwarzschild solution, the so-called solution to this set of field equations. All you have to do is look up Schwarzschild's original paper, which I've done, and you find that the solutions are very different. Schwarzschild's solution doesn't allow a black hole. Hilbert's solution, which was a corruption of Schwarzschild's solution, is misinterpreted and allows a black hole, supposedly. We'll see how why. Okay, so we see from the first proof that we've got a circular argument where there's allegedly matter, but there is actually no matter. So this doesn't describe anything. So in other words, when you set the energy momentum tensor to 0, Einstein's tensor can't reduce to Rick equals 0. So the whole idea of that is fallacious. And the solution to that, of course, means it's fallacious as well. And that's Hilbert's solution, Schwarzschild's solution, and any other solutions. They're all the equivalent solutions to these. That's a pretty simple proof that the whole idea is very dubious. Now, if we come to the second proof, Einstein asserted that his principle of equivalence and his laws of special relativity must hold in sufficiently small, finite regions of his gravitational field, and that these regions can be located anywhere in his gravitational field. Now, I'll point out that both the principle of equivalence and the laws of special relativity are actually defined in terms of the a priori presence of multiple, arbitrarily large, finite masses and photons, right? And we see here a quote from the Dictionary of Geophysics, Astrophysics and Astronomy. Black holes were first discovered as purely mathematical solutions of Einstein's field equations. This solution, the Schwarzschild black hole, is a nonlinear solution of the Einstein equations of general relativity. It contains no matter. We already established that. And exists forever in an asymptotically flat space-time. So, since it's empty, it can't be a black hole. Now, there's another point here. This, a black hole, and all black hole solutions pertain to a universe that allegedly contains only one mass. So the universe contains a lot more than one mass. And what you mean by a gravitational field to a universe that contains only one mass? First, it doesn't model anything realistically. And how do you detect the gravitational field if you don't put in some other masses? Well, we've only got a one mass body here, a one mass universe. So you can't get a black hole. Doesn't make any sense. Now, the principle of superposition doesn't apply in general relativity because Einstein's field equations are highly nonlinear. Now, mathematically, this is a very simple expression. If you have a solution x and y, two separate solutions, then the linear combination ax plus by is not a solution. All right? That's what the principle of superposition means mathematically. Well, when we talk about it physically, this simply means that one cannot pile up matter into any given space-time solution to obtain additional matters, charges, photons, and electromagnetic fields, etc., as desired. So in other words, you've got a black hole solution. It contains one mass in the whole universe. You cannot then just arbitrarily say, oh, what I'll do is I think I'll put in another black hole and another black hole so that all these black holes mutually exist and mutually interact in a mutual space-time that by mathematical construction contains no matter. How does that work? Well, they do, or the proponents of the black hole actually just do that by a force analogy with Newton's theory. Because in Newton's theory, there is no relationship between matter and space. There is no causal connection between them, and the principle of superposition applies. And that's why in Newton's theorem, or Newton's theory, we can have as many masses as you like. Now, if you want to work out the interaction of three bodies revolving around each body center of gravity, it becomes very complicated. And beyond that, we can't solve them because the equations become too difficult. But there's no conceptual reason why you can't stick in all sorts of matter, photons, lots of stars, and the rest of it. But in Einstein's theory, you cannot. This means that every single configuration of matter that you propose for a solution to Einstein's field equations must be described by an appropriate energy momentum tensor, and the field equations solved separately for that particular configuration. That's never been done. Why? Because there are no known solutions to Einstein's field equations for two or more masses, and there's no existence theorem by which you can even assert that his field equations contain latent solutions for such configurations of matter. So all solutions to Einstein's field equations pertain to only one of two things: a universe that contains nothing, or a universe that contains one mass, whether it be cosmological or otherwise. That models nothing in reality, and it has really no meaning, because we know from experiments that gravitation is an interaction between two bodies. And this is, for example, in the experiments of Cavendish. You take two cylinders, or two spheres, spherical bodies, they're suspended, they're fixed, and then you release them. They'll approach one another. Okay? You take one, well, what else have you got? You know, there's nothing to do with it. It just sits there. Okay, so again, we can say that Rick equals 0 is a space-time that by mathematical construction contains no matter, and owing to the principle of equivalence, you can't stick in more. So the black hole can't possibly exist because it's a one-body solution, right? I'll come to some other issues shortly and show you that that doesn't even make sense. So a few more comments on this proof 3. As I said, there are no known solutions to his field equations for two or more masses. No existence theorem by which it can be even asserted that his field equations contain latent solutions for such configurations. So all talks of multiple black holes is quite meaningless. But what do we get told? Mr. Hawking tells us for existence, oh, black holes are merging. Black holes are in binary systems. Black holes collide. Where did he get all these extra black holes? He just stuck them in.
Black hole life.
You can't do that. It's impossible in Einstein's theory because it's a nonlinear system. Just like in nonlinear systems of differential equations, you can have solutions, two different solutions to a linear differential equation, add them together, and that creates another solution. If you have two separate solutions to nonlinear differential equations, you add them together, you don't get a solution to that nonlinear equation. That's it. Okay. So as I've remarked before, I'll just reiterate that all black hole solutions pertain to a universe that allegedly contains only one mass. And so they are totally invalid models. Proof 4 is a little bit of mathematics here. Don't be frightened of it. It looks complicated, but when we break it down, it really becomes pretty simple. Now, this is Hilbert's solution, and usually they write C and G equal to unity. And so you get a simplified expression, but that hides everything. It's a bit slick, but so I've written it here with C and G explicitly, so nothing can be hidden. And you'll see why I've done that and how black hole escape velocities are allegedly obtained, how radii of so-called event horizons are obtained, and we'll see that that's really another fudge, because there are things called the components of the metric tensor. We can easily read them off. We don't have to really know greatly what we mean by a metric tensor. But first I'll say what we mean by a metric. Well, they're either called line elements or metrics. This is nothing other than a fancy name for a distance formula. And we all learned in high school how to calculate the distance between 2 points with coordinates x1, y1 and x2, y2 in the Euclidean plane. So you get delta s squared is equal to delta x squared plus delta y squared. You can extend that to 3 dimensions and add a delta z squared. It's a distance formula. And in that case, all the signs of the components are positive. Notice in this one, it's very, very strange because the time part, which has got the dt squared there, is positive, and all the other parts are negative. So we call it a pseudo-Riemannian metric space because it relates to Riemannian geometry, and because of its differences in signs, it's called pseudo-Riemannian. Just complicated names for some complicated mathematical ideas. So what we really want to know is components of the metric tensor for this expression. Well, we can read them off. It's really easy. And we'll give the names for the metric tensor G with two subscripts on them because we're dealing with second order tensors. So G naught naught is 1 minus 2 gm over c squared r, G11 minus 1 over 1 minus 2 gm over c squared r, G2 minus r squared, and G33 minus r squared sine squared theta. What you see is that these are nothing other than the coefficients of the differential elements that appear in the first expression. Okay, now, before I go on to do an analysis of these two G00s and G11s, first we want to identify what R is. This becomes quite hilarious. Here's what the proponents of the black hole tell us. The quantity R has been variously and vaguely called a distance, the radius of a two-sphere, the coordinate radius, the radial coordinate, the Schwarzschild R coordinate, the radial space coordinate, the areal radius, the reduced circumference, the shortest distance a light ray travels to the center, and finally, a gauge choice. It defines the coordinate R. Now, in the particular case of R equals 2gm/c squared, it is invariably called the Schwarzschild radius, or the gravitational radius, namely for the radius of the event horizon of the black hole. Well, there's a lot of definitions here. Which one do you want to pick? No? Well, they're all wrong. It's easy to prove. Then to reiterate a little bit further on this, in his paper on a stationary system with spherical symmetry consisting of many gravitating bodies, Einstein himself continually and incorrectly refers to R as a radius. You can easily verify that by looking at the paper. You can download it from the internet. So with all these definitions, what do you conclude? I conclude that there's utter confusion. That Einstein and his followers just don't know what R is. That's the truth of it. With all those definitions, as I said, it's just an arbitrary choice. But this is a geometric relation. And so we must have a definite geometric relation for all the components in this expression. Okay, so the correct identification of R completely invalidates the black hole once again. Well, you'll never see it in the literature because I think I'm the only one that ever made the calculation. So let's consider the identity of R just for the fun of this. Now, as we saw in the previous expression here for the metric, there was a time part and a spatial part. Well, I've taken out the spatial part. It's got all positive signs because you saw that there was the time part minus all the spatial bit. Well, so the spatial bit is just all of this. It's all positive signs. Now, if we take the surface in this spatial section, that's the last bit on the end here, R squared, d theta squared plus sine squared theta d phi squared. There are only two variables here. The things that are variable are theta and phi. They're angular quantities. R doesn't change. You know, it can change later when we're looking at the later metric, but we're going to consider this surface. Now, there is a thing called Gaussian curvature. Gaussian curvature is a property of a surface, and it's an intrinsic property of a surface. Carl Gauss proved this long ago, and that's why it's named after him. Now, it's independent of any embedding space. What do I mean? If you take this surface and you embed it in ordinary Euclidean 3 space, for example, right? That doesn't change the nature of the intrinsic geometry of the surface. So we can consider the intrinsic geometry of the surface without any consideration of any embedding space, whether it be Euclidean 3 space or the very complicated looking 4-dimensional pseudo-Riemannian space-time metric that is proposed by Einstein and his followers. So how do we calculate the Gaussian curvature of a surface? Well, it's really easy. Any differential geometry book will tell you if the Gaussian curvature is K, it's equal to R sub 1212 over G. Well, when we look at R sub 1212, well, we recognize that as a tensor. What order is it? Well, we count them up. There's 1, 2, 3, 4. There's 4 subscripts. So it's a 4th order tensor. And in this case, it's just written as a covariant tensor. 4 order tensor. Okay, and what's G? It's the determinant of the metric tensor. In the previous slide, we saw the components of the metric tensor, which we just read off and wrote down. And so we find the determinant of that. In this particular case, there is only 2 because we've got R squared and sine squared theta. They're the only 2 coefficients of the differential elements. So this is a much simpler calculation. Although, if you do it by hand, it's a bit tedious, takes a lot of paper, sharp pencil, and a bottle of aspirin. I know, I've done it. Okay, now so for Hilbert's metric, if we make this calculation, we won't worry about how it's done, as I said, because it takes reams of paper, but we get the result that K is equal to 1 over R squared. So if we rearrange that for R, we get R is equal to 1 over K. What does that mean? Well, that means that the R is actually the inverse square root of the Gaussian curvature. Now we know what R is. How many relativists tell you that? None, because they don't know. But that's the reality. Now let's consider the terms G naught naught and G11. And they say that they have values between 0 to infinity, including naught. And when R equals 2 GM over C squared, we can put that in there and we find that G naught naught equals 0 and G11 equals minus 1 over naught. That's division by 0. We learned in primary school, can you divide by 0? No, it's undefined. But they say, no, this is a singularity. And sometimes they say, with a very unscientific term, they'll say, the metric blows up. It does it? Blows up. That's real scientific. Okay, now let's look at when happens when R equals naught. We've got 1 minus 2 GM over naught. Well, that's division by naught again. And G11 equals minus 1 over 1 minus 2 GM over naught. So we've got division by naught twice. And they say that's another singularity. In his book, Hawking says, in this book, The Theory of Everything, etc., Hawking says, the work that Roger Penrose and I did between 1965 and 70 showed that, according to general relativity, there must be a singularity of infinite density within the black hole. They think by dividing by 0, you get infinity. How does that happen? So in the book Tensor Geometry by Dodson and Poston, they say once a body of mass m lies within its Schwarzschild radius, they're calling it a radius again. It's not a radius. We've already established what it is. It relates to Gaussian curvature. And so it's not a distance, let alone a radius, in Hilbert's metric. So it's got nothing to do with distance. So a singularity becomes physical, not a limiting fiction. Well, that's marvelous. Divide by naught and you haven't got a limiting fiction. Also, by special relativity, we can calculate density, where m over v, well, m is with the mass of the moving body, v the volume of the moving body, and we get, in terms of the rest mass and the rest volume, this expression. Well, that forbids infinite density. But we saw earlier that according to Einstein's theory, both the principle of equivalence and the laws of special relativity must manifest in his gravitational field. And then we're told that they've got infinite densities. Well, if that's supposed to hold in his gravitational field, and it forbids it, doesn't allow it. So the idea of an infinite density again is pretty silly. I'll just put this up quickly. You might wonder what the real R is. Well, this is what real R is in the metric. You calculate this, and you get this expression in the middle. And if you look at this, if you take values of R less than alpha, you get square root of a negative number. Well, that's not allowed because it's supposed to be the real radius. Radius goes from naught to whatever, but it's not the square root of a negative number. That's the real radius. It's straightforward differential geometry. That expression is never found in the literature either. We find that RIC equals 0 is quite meaningless because it leads to all of this nonsense that I've been talking about with divisions by 0 and violation of the fact that the radius can't have a negative value. They say that the gravitational field of a black hole has a escape velocity of c, and they rearrange that value that they put in there. C is equal to 2 GM over R. Well, what do we recognise that as? That's Newton's escape velocity. So they've put in their arbitrarily assigned to their constant of integration. They've assigned it in such a way to put in Newton's value for a square for escape velocity. But escape velocity is a two-body object. One body escapes from another body. What does it mean? That's what it means. So how can you have a two-body relation, even though it only contains a one mass in it, but it's an implicit two-body relation? How can that appear in a solution for a alleged set of equations that pertains to a universe that can only contain one mass? You can't. So it can't be there. We see here that according to Hawking again, I had already discussed with Roger Penrose the idea of defining a black hole as a set of events from which it is possible to escape to a large distance. It means that the boundary of the black hole, the event horizon, is formed by rays of light that just fail to get away from the black hole. Instead, stays hovering on the edge of the black hole. So on the one hand, they say the escape velocity of the black hole is c. That means light can escape. On the other hand, they're telling us light can't even leave. What? So that's pretty silly. Here's another one, how they say that Newton's theory predicts it. In the paper, this paper here by Salotti, Miller and Sciama, they say, I'll read the top and bottom, the bit in the middle is just a quote from John Michell. In his famous article of 1784, which is seen as being the beginning of the story of black holes, John Michell wrote this, blah, blah, blah. There are at the very beginning, the theoretically predicted properties of Newtonian black holes were discovered together with a carefully worded statement about how it might be determined observationally whether such objects do in fact exist. But this is the so-called Michel-Laplace dark body. It doesn't possess the signatures of the alleged black hole, so it's not a black hole. Well, why? First, the black hole requires irresistible gravitational collapse. That doesn't. It has an infinitely dense point mass singularity. That doesn't. It has an event horizon. That doesn't. It exists in a universe and contains only one mass. That doesn't. It's got lots of them, right? And the principle of superposition applies therefore there. This sits in a universe which is described by a three-dimensional Euclidean space, whereas the other one is described by an object in a four-dimensional pseudo-Riemannian metric space. Well, they're not even in the same geometry. So we see that the Newtonian Michel-Laplace dark body does not possess the signatures of a black hole. So it's not a black hole. But they'll tell us, as you see there, that it's a black hole. I'd like to quickly say something about Big Bang. It was mentioned by the previous speaker, and it was conjured up by the Abbé Georges Lemaitre, who was a Belgian mathematician and Catholic priest. Now you'll see here, Lemaitre was at the time both a member of the Catholic hierarchy and an accomplished scientist. Alfvén reported that Lemaitre said in private that his theory was a way to reconcile science with St. Thomas Aquinas' theological dictum of creatio ex nihilo, or creation out of nothing. And in January 1933, Lemaitre travelled with Einstein to California for a series of seminars. And after Lemaitre detailed his Big Bang, Einstein got up and applauded and said, "This is the most beautiful and satisfactory explanation of creation to which I have ever listened." Well, what's the problem here? The problem here is that Lemaitre has admitted to Alfvén that he used his ideology to predetermine the outcome of a scientific inquiry. That means he's violated scientific method. Simple. Imagine an engineer using his ideology to decide on how he's going to design and build a bridge. Oh, I don't like the way we do it. I'm a communist or a capitalist or a minutist. I'm going to decide that I'm going to do it my way. So Lemaitre did that. Now, the other thing about it is, as I said, there are no solutions for more than one body. So the Big Bang creationism treats the universe, the whole universe, as completely filled by a single, indivisible mass of uniform density and pressure. What does that describe?
A ball.
One body, again. But the universe is full of billions of stars, billions of galaxies. So this is a totally meaningless model. You see the analogy often in textbooks where they're blowing up a balloon and they've got spots all over the balloon and they say, these are all the galaxies. Where do they get them? This is a single body problem. So the analogy is quite false because it gives you the idea that you've got many masses. Well, this is not true because it's indivisible, because it's treated as a fluid of uniform pressure and density. So we got, again, back to the old problem that Einstein's theory can only describe an empty universe or a one-body universe. Gravitational waves. This is important. I've quoted Dirac here. If you see here,
Or an etheric universe on accident. Look at that.
he says that you can't obtain an expression for energy of the gravitational field satisfying the conditions that when
added together forms of energy, the total energy is conserved, and 2, the energy within a finite three-dimensional region at a certain time is independent of the coordinate system. Now he goes on to say here, the best we can do is use the pseudo-tensor. This is a very important point. I'm going to come to that very soon. And then he says, let us consider the energy of these waves. Owing to the pseudo-tensor not being a tensor, we do not get in general a clear result independent of coordinate system. And there is a special case in which we do get a clear result, namely when the waves are all moving in the same direction. Well, this is Einstein's pseudo-tensor. We see that it's a second-order tensor and it's mixed, U and V. Okay. Now, the first thing is that Einstein says that this describes the energy components of his gravitational field. Now, that's implicated with his gravitational waves. Here we have an expression. Einstein writes the total energy and momentum of his gravitational field as E is equal to the sum of what? The pseudo-tensor and the energy momentum tensor written in mixed form. Then he takes an ordinary divergence. He can't take a tensor divergence because he hasn't got a tensor sum. He's got a pseudo-tensor plus a tensor. So he's restricted to this kind of operation. And then he says, thus it results from our field equations of gravitation that the laws of conservation of energy and momentum are satisfied. And we have to introduce the totality of the energy components of matter and the gravitational field. That can't be true. This is a complicated looking expression. I've actually explained it to you. It's really simple when we do. You see that the energy, that the pseudo-tensor is defined by the top. Square root of minus g is just the square root of the components of the determinant of the metric tensor. And L and the other parts here are derivatives of components of the metric tensor. We look at L. L on the left, there's the components of the metric tensor again, but written in contravariant form because they're superscripts. And all these gamma functions, complicated looking stuff. Let's have a look at what a gamma function is defined as. It's on the left, you see the components of the metric tensor again, and then we see in the brackets the first derivatives of the components of the metric tensor. And so up top there, they've just used this shorthand for the derivatives. Okay. Now in tensors, written in mixed form like this, you can perform something called a contraction. And the contraction is you set the top and the bottom suffixes equal. So we make UV and U equal. We get this expression. Okay, and we get what's called an invariant. T is equal to T to the power to the superscript U and subscript U. Now, if you perform the calculation, we get the whole, that bit there in brackets becomes 2L. And if we stick that back into the equations, we get this and rearrange, we get this for the value of the pseudo-tensor. It's L over minus G. Okay. Now, bearing in mind the definitions of L and G, we see that the invariant, L over the square root of minus G, is composed solely of the components of the metric tensor and their first derivatives and nothing else. That's pretty straightforward. We know what first derivatives are from high school, and if we don't take the derivative of it, well, that's it. So Einstein's expressions then, we see a result for his metric tensor is composed like this. But Tullio Levi-Civita and Ricky Cabastro, Giorgio Ricky Cabastro, the two Italian inventors of tensor calculus, proved in 1900 that such invariants like this don't exist. So in other words, Einstein's pseudo-tensor is a meaningless concoction of mathematical symbols. It looks pretty, but it means nothing. And so his energy and his conservation of energy are totally meaningless because the pseudo-tensor is rubbish. Now, this means that we have to rewrite Einstein's field equations in this form. I've written it there on the left-hand side, just rearranged it, and then I can write it in mixed form, doesn't make any difference, and we compare the mixed form with the expression for energy. And what do we see? That the energy momentum tensor is still there, but in place of the pseudo-tensor, which we know is rubbish, we've got now GUV over kappa. So now GUV over kappa, that's a tensor. So we've got a tensor expression for his field equations, and it's also an energy expression.
Look at there.
Right? But Pauli says that Einstein raised the objection to this formulation that with this definition of the gravitational energy, the total energy of a closed system would always be zero. And the maintenance of this value of the energy does not require the continued existence of the system of one form or another. The usual kind of conclusions could not then be drawn from the conservation laws? Well, in other words, Einstein's field equations now violate the usual conservation laws, well established by experiment. So his field equations are now in conflict with experiment, right? The total energy is naught, so how can you localize energy? You can't. There are no gravitational waves, you know? So the gravitational wave, again, is completely nonsense. Another thing I'd like to say about gravitational waves is they usually derive from the linearized form of Einstein's field equations. Why do they linearize them? Well, because they can't solve the nonlinear systems, so they linearize them. Any engineer knows that that's a big problem. If you start linearizing nonlinear systems, you start throwing out a lot of the important parts, right? Well, when you do that with Einstein's field equations, what you get is a set of equations that are not coordinate independent. But according to Einstein, all the laws of physics must be coordinate independent and therefore expressible in tensor form. Now, the fact of the matter is, with the formulation now of the linearized equations, the speed of propagation of gravitational waves, according to Einstein, is c. That's not true, because the in the non-linearized system, they are coordinate dependent. So you can select any set of coordinates you like and you get any speed you like. So in other words, select a different set of coordinates, the propagation of the gravitational waves is greater or less than c. It's any one you like. So which one do you want to pick? Einstein and his followers arbitrarily pick the one that they want to satisfy the desire of the statement that they want the gravitational waves to travel at the speed of c. This is totally arbitrary. And so it has no physical meaning. All the other coordinates are just as valid. So again, the gravitational wave is completely meaningless. That's why LIGO has always been destined to detect nothing. And how much does it cost? I think it's well over $1 billion now. Other parts around the world, countries around the world, including Australia, have counterparts. They're looking for gravitational waves from binary black holes. You know, we know that that can't be possible. You know, so what are they looking for? They're looking for a phantasm. It's always been a phantasm. And why? Based on completely unrealistic or incorrect analysis of the field equations in Einstein's theory. Now, there's a couple of things I'd like to mention quickly here before I finish in relation to the electric universe, because of what I've talked about so far is why Einstein's concept of the gravitational field cannot hold. And so it's a dead theory. It can't be saved. And his pseudo-tensor attempt to do that fails because it's a meaningless piece of mathematical mumbo-jumbo. Nikolai Kozyrev was a Russian astronomer, and he discovered the atmosphere of Mercury, and he also discovered lunar volcanism. But in his doctoral thesis on sources of stellar energy and the theory of the internal constitution of stars, I recommend that if you were interested in this, to take down this website, and you can download it for free. It's a very interesting paper. It was written in the 1940s, and what does he prove? He proves that the standard model proposed by Hans Bethe of the carbon-nitrogen thermonuclear fusion cycle for the sun is complete nonsense. He shows that the temperature at the core of the sun, and hence of other stars, is so low that it cannot initiate and sustain a thermonuclear reaction. He also shows that the Hertzsprung-Russell diagram for evolution of stars, etc., is completely erroneous. And he also shows that E equals mc squared does not account for the energy from stars. In other words, stars are not losing matter, not losing mass. They are stable. And he says, and we came to the conclusion, which is very important, it was partly mentioned in earlier talks, that the radiation from stars acts as a kind of regulator so that stars remain stable for billions and billions of years. Now, this is important because it shows that the electric universe ideas have support from an analysis done by Kozyrev back in the 1940s. It was only in 2005 that Kozyrev's paper was translated into English by the Russian Dr. Dmitry Rabunsky and myself, and published in journal Progress in Physics, because we thought that it was very important to be known. And Kozyrev offered no alternative as to how stars radiate and what their internal constitution is. He just says what it can't be. This is very important because it shows that the standard model doesn't hold, and it's been known since the 40s. What happened to that knowledge? It's been completely unknown outside the West. Finally, Professor Pierre-Marie Roberteau of Ohio State University here in the United States has written a series of papers, and I've given you the website where you can find them. There are a number of papers there, and you just scroll down to the year 2011, and in volume 3, you will find all his papers there where he proposes a liquid plasma model of the sun. Now, this has implications for the electric universe paradigm because of the plasma nature of the thing. Now, I asked Pierre, how did he come up with this idea of liquid plasma? He said, well, I coined the term because charged particles such as plasma have a order. And not only that, they flow like a fluid under the influence of electric and magnetic fields, right? So I think there's a great deal of information here that would be very useful to the electric universe ideas as well, because there's probably a lot of overlap here, and we can get good ideas from one another by studying these papers.
Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info.
That new hotness.
Comet science may stand at the precipice of revolutionary change. For well over half a century, consensus scientific theory has proposed that comets are icy bodies that formed billions of years ago in the solar system's infancy. Comet activity, including the production of filamentary jets and a cometary coma, is said to result from the sublimation of ices as a comet's orbit brings it closer to the sun. However, for many years, scientific discovery has done nothing to increase confidence in standard comet theory. Close-up images of comet nuclei have revealed desiccated terrains, with nothing like the expected abundance of surface ice, and the hypothesized subsurface comet ice remains conjecture. Scientists have never found the theoretical vents or nozzles from which comet jets are thought to emanate, just one of many puzzles that demand new pathways of investigation. Electrical theories of comets may provide such pathways. Many of the most surprising comet discoveries were either predicted or become explicable by electrical interpretations, including the discovery of fast-moving electrons and electric fields close to the nucleus of Comet 67P. The detection of the signature of water molecules in cometary comas has long been thought to confirm the existence of abundant subsurface comet ice. But is there a better explanation? For several years, Thunderbolt's colleague Dr. Franklin Anariba has developed concepts of electrochemical reactions on comets, which may be the cause of much comet activity, including the production of the detected comet water. Recently, scientists studying data on the Lovejoy comet C2014 Q2 have reported findings that may affirm many of the principles Dr. Anariba has proposed. Today, Dr. Anariba offers a detailed analysis of these findings and explains the electrochemical processes that may happen on comets.
Let us put things in perspective. After the completion of the Rosetta probe journey around the Comet 67P, the origin of water observed in the coma is not clear, especially since the surface of the comet has been determined to be dark and dry. However, there are other possibilities for the origin of such water. Let us discuss one possibility. In a recent paper by Pagini et al. Titled Ground-Based Detection of Deuterated Water in Comet C/2014 Q2, also known as Lovejoy, at infrared wavelengths, published in the Astrophysical Journal Letters. Comet Lovejoy is studied via infrared spectroscopy at an Earth-based observatory using infrared emission lines for water, H2O, and heavy water, HDO, where D refers to deuterium, which contains 1 proton, 2 neutrons, 1 electron, unlike hydrogen, which contains 1 of each. The study used a near-infrared spectrometer located at the Keck Observatory during post-perihelion. The results suggest a water production rate of 5.9 times 10 to the 29 molecules per second, or about 17,641,196 liters per second, and a heavy water production rate of 3.6 times 10 to the 26 molecules per second, or about 11,255 liters per second. From these production rates, the DH ratio in Comet Lovejoy's water is extracted to be 3.02 times 10 to the minus 4, or more meaningfully, about 1.94 versus the DNS standard mean ocean DH ratio, which is taken as the benchmark and refers to the DH ratio in the ocean on Earth. It is important to highlight in this report that this DH ratio was methodically obtained by avoiding unnecessary systematic variables such as measurements on different days, different telescopes, as well as observations of water and heavy water separately. Subsequently, this DH ratio is compared against measurements carried out pre-perihelion via radio wave means, which display a ratio of only 0.89 versus the DNS standard mean ocean water. In other words, the DH ratio increases by a factor of 2.2 pre to post-perihelion. This is significant. In the manuscript title 67P Churyumov-Gerasimenko, a Jupiter family comet with a high DH ratio by Altwag et al., published in Science, a DH ratio value of 5.3 times 10 to the minus 4 is reported, which is not consistent with previous Jupiter family of comets, GFC data, strongly suggesting that the DH ratio of the Jupiter family of comets is highly heterogeneous. The cause of this high DH ratio is usually attributed to deuterium-enriched water ice in the Protosolar Nebula. Since this solar system formation is speculative, I will not elaborate on such explanation. However, a recent article by Yao and Yapis titled Dynamic Deuterium Enrichment in Cometary Water via Elie-Rideout Reactions, a different pathway for deuterium enrichment is proposed, namely the collision of cold with 10 to 15 electron volts and hyperthermal with 10 to 200 electron volts water ions against deuterium-enriched surfaces. The authors state water ions in the extended coma are accelerated toward the nucleus, where they collide with the outer nucleus crust of 67P, where the crust is dehydrated and includes typical cometary minerals such as olivine and pyroxene silicates and carbonaceous refractory minerals. Likewise, whole water ions moving away from the nucleus will collide with those particles in the extended coma, which have a chemical composition similar to that of the nucleus crust. The authors were able to demonstrate in the laboratory that silicon oxide and highly ordered graphitic carbon absorbs deuterium atoms via the bombardment of heavy water ions, D2O+, for 30 minutes at 200 electron volts, resulting in the formation of H2DO+ cations. This chemical pathway proposed can reasonably be called water ion implantation on the surface of the nucleus, and it is based on observational facts, especially the reported presence of hyperthermal water ions in the vicinity of Comet 67P, although less certain on the nature of deuterated surfaces on comets. The key concept is that electric fields lead the way for the chemical reaction. I did previously state that a great number of chemical compounds observed in the coma and surface of comets is being driven electrochemically by energy provided to electric fields, which accelerate ions to sufficient kinetic energy and collision angles to result in bond formation processes. Therefore, It is quite refreshing to see that other researchers are beginning to be comfortable with the idea that a great number of complex chemical reactions are being driven by chemical means in the absence of solar radiation and/or high temperatures. Provided the data reported for Comet Lovejoy indicating an increase in the DH ratio pre- and post-perihelion is subsequently validated, I would argue that such data is an indirect indication of the influence of the solar flux in the electrochemical formation of water and heavy water observed in the coma and nucleus of comets. It is well known that deuterium is synthesized in the atmospheres of stars, and this applies to the sun, which then ejects deuterium via the solar flux electric fields. As a comet approaches the sun to an increasing voltage gradient, it encounters a higher deuterium density, which translates to an increased electrochemical heavy water formation, providing an overall high DH ratio as a function of heliocentric distance.
Hello, Cena
In
Chat.
summary,
What's
in this episode, I propose that heavy water formation is not necessarily the result, although it can be to some extent, of water implantation on deuterated surfaces, but rather a direct electrochemical process mediated by electric fields of concentrated deuterium containing the solar flux interacting with hydroxide ions originating from refractory minerals and carbonation materials found in dust grains in the coma, as well as on the surface of comets. The complex chemical reactions observed on comets and other cosmic bodies are very likely driven by chemical means at low temperatures and in the absence of solar radiation.
For continuous updates on space news from the electric universe, stay tuned to thunderbolts.info. Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. New scientific reports are offering further confirmation of the importance of electrical processes in planetary geology. Scientists studying the mysterious sand dunes of the Saturnian moon Titan are reporting that electrostatic forces may play a significant role in configuring the dunes' puzzling shapes. What makes the dunes especially odd is that they frequently point in the opposite direction of Titan's prevailing winds. A Scientific American article reports the team's findings as follows. Some scientists are suggesting a shocking solution to these backward-facing drifts. They may be sculpted not only by wind, but also by electrostatic forces. A co-author of the paper, published in the journal Nature Geoscience, says of the findings, "Why do Titan's dunes look like they're going the wrong way, against the wind? One way to explain it is if the sands are sticky and don't move very much most of the time from the wind, which is what you'd expect if the sands were electrified, electrostatically charged and clumped together. It turns out the sands of Titan should be very susceptible to charging in a unique way. The scientists believe that a number of environmental factors on Titan, including the chemical composition of its soils, its low gravity, and its minimal exposure to sunlight all combine to produce extreme electrostatic clinging when the grains collide and produce electrostatic charge. On this series, we have long argued that electrostatic forces have shaped many puzzling dune-like features on various bodies in our solar system, including the frozen dunes of the dwarf planet Pluto and the dunes of the comet 67P. However, like the immense electrified dust devils that NASA scientists have identified on Mars, on Titan, investigators may be confusing cause and effect. What the scientists have not considered is that Titan's winds may themselves be an electrical phenomenon. Electric fields produce ionic winds, such as those found in air purifiers, and as repeatedly referenced on this series, experiments such as those seen here by Billy Elverton can produce dunes simply by applying electric fields to plates of dust and other materials. In fact, the same electrical effects that could produce Titan's sand dunes may also be responsible for other mysterious geological phenomena on the moon. Scientists were surprised to observe what they interpret as the movements of so-called putative lakes, canyons, and river valleys across the surface of Titan. NASA investigators believe that a portion of Titan's crust could be disconnected by subsurface liquids, causing surface features to, quote, slide around. But the theoretical oceans of subsurface liquids on Titan, like the Saturnian moon Enceladus, remain an unproven assumption. What is known is that the gas giant Saturn and its moons are connected by electrical currents, and these current systems may be responsible for numerous heretofore unresolved geological mysteries, including the so-called ice geysers on Enceladus. Thunderbolt's Picture of the Day managing editor Stephen Smith writes in his 2014 article, Impressions of Titan. Titan is an electrically charged body that is constantly bombarded by intense ion beams from Saturn. It shares many characteristics with its cousin moons, Io and Europa, that orbit the planet Jupiter, a particle fountain from its poles, a toroid of charged particles in a sheath, and exchanges of massive electric charge. In a picture of the day about volcanoes on Io, the fact that the calderas have several, quote, hotspots moved by several kilometers in a few short months was attributed to the plasma beams that complete an electric circuit with the moon and Jupiter. Points where plasma discharges from Jupiter touch down on Io exhibit an intense glow. Similar electrical phenomena could be influencing Titan's geology. One similarity between Earth and Titan is that both planetary bodies have powerful polar winds that are said to, quote, pull gases from their atmospheres out into space. As noted in a recent Space News report, scientists have recently acknowledged that powerful electric fields play a role in the supersonic plasma jets recently discovered in Earth's upper atmosphere. On Titan and other planetary bodies, it is only reasonable to consider that electric fields may produce ionic winds, which creates sand dunes and other geological features that have proved very puzzling for planetary scientists. We also predict that these features will continue to be discovered on bodies such as comets and other airless worlds, which do not have the necessary atmospheres to produce mechanical winds. It is encouraging to see increasing discussions in scientific literature of electrostatic forces playing a significant role in planetary geology. But for now, these discussions emphasize the need for all of the space sciences to recognize the undeniable significance of electricity in nature. For continuous updates on space news from the electric universe, stay tuned to thunderbolts.info. Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. On this series, we have recently presented reports that challenge some of the bedrock beliefs about the history of our planet, our solar system, and the universe as a whole. When it comes to our own world, the fundamental belief system shaping all of modern geology and astronomy is uniformitarianism, or the notion that changes in nature happen incrementally over eons of time. It's the position of the Thunderbolts Project that evidence from increasingly fine data in numerous specialized fields only confirms the hypothesis of recent catastrophic events on our planet and in the inner solar system. In this episode, Bishop Nicholas Sykes explores the question, is our history far different from that which official science proposes?
My previous videos in this series have considered the serious possibility of the science of the modern schools being wrong in areas of cosmology and physics about such diverse topics and phenomena as black holes, the Oort cloud, the composition and genesis of comets, the model of magnetic reconnection, the way the sun and other stars are powered, and Einsteinian relativity, including its restriction of the speed of gravity to the supposed maximum possible speed of electromagnetic radiation in vacua. Science, however, is a broad subject. Indeed, one might adduce from the above, and far from exhaustive catalogue of contradictions that my colleagues and I are claiming that the whole enterprise of science is flawed in principle. It is necessary to deny that deduction categorically. In my view, what we are claiming is that human intellectual and moral error have, especially during the last 100 years, brought about grave flaws in that intellectual structure that in the second decade of the 21st century is being presented in the schools and in the media as settled science. One basic mistake is to ignore the reality that any science may only be regarded meaningfully as settled, and only tentatively at that, when its various theories continue to be open to being tested by experiment and observation. Any science theory claiming that further investigation into it is closed has by that claim unsettled itself. If some new observational or experimental discovery is considered to disturb what was formerly regarded as settled, then the true scientific method will seek to find further resources of observation or experimentation to investigate the issue. Too often one perceives those in their settled science castles pulling up the drawbridges as if new observations, experiments, and science models must be science's enemies, rather than having the possibilities of bringing health and renewal to the great structure of science and science education that our generation is called to bequeath to the future. One of the most long-standing such settled science castles is that model of the Earth's history that may be referred to as Lyellian uniformitarianism. Charles Lyell, 1797 to 1875, who preceded Charles Darwin, 1809 to 1882, and upon whose thought Darwin came to draw, accepting, one supposes, the Newtonian impression of a solar system that had run like clockwork for all of history, laid down the view that whatever past changes had ever been brought about in nature would have been essentially no different than what was observable in the present. And it seemed obvious that in the present time, natural changes were slow. Lyell's model of natural change in course of time overtook older models of catastrophic change accepted by many researchers, and particularly by Georges Cuvier, 1769 to 1832. In more recent times, models of punctuated evolution have been proposed by Stephen Jay Gould and others, but the conditions...
Remember to share and invite your friends over if anybody's new, or if it slips anybody's mind or whatever. The more the merrier, you know how it goes.
It is therefore by no means altogether surprising that the electric universe model, which envisages catastrophic changes not only before the advent of man, or even only in man's prehistory, but actually within the historical period, has found the drawbridges being drawn up against its advance into the halls of academia. Catastrophe that is long ago and far away is one thing, but the possibility of catastrophe within human history is quite another. Once we accept that, who knows what the geological clock might begin to reveal about our own history, or indeed suggests about the future. Notwithstanding all this, the model of Lyellian uniformitarianism, if we are prepared to be scientific about
as far as flat Earth exists,
should, in the name of science,
none of this exists.
be subjected to fresh scrutiny. Might not the EU model, which does encompass recent catastrophic change, be a means of renewing the science of our current geological and evolutionary outlook? For the science story of our own day, sticking to a centuries-old uniformitarianism has given us the mantra of no natural catastrophes for billions of years. The electric universe account, on the other hand, tells that such catastrophes must have occurred even within the lifespan of humanity. Let us, at the very least, put the two accounts head to head, ponder the matter, and learn.
For continuous updates on space news from the electric universe, stay tuned to thunderbolts.info. Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. A groundbreaking new scientific report provides dramatic confirmation of our planet's dynamic electrical environment and the Earth-Sun connection. Phys.org recently reported that the European Space Agency's Swarm mission has discovered, quote, supersonic plasma jets high up in our atmosphere that can push temperatures up to almost 10,000 degrees Celsius. Attempting to provide historical context for the discovery, the report states, the theory that there are huge electric currents powered by solar wind and guided through the ionosphere by Earth's magnetic field was postulated more than a century ago by Norwegian scientist Christian Birkeland. While much is known about these current systems, recent observations have revealed that they are associated with large electrical fields. In fact, in recent years, the term Birkeland current has appeared with increasing regularity in mainstream scientific literature. Today, Professor Donald Scott discusses his own original modeling of a Birkeland current structure, and he explores the significance of this new discovery from the electric universe perspective.
SWARM is a constellation of 3 satellites designed to look at the geomagnetic field of Earth. They wanted to put some decent sensors, better sensors than had ever been flown before, I guess, up and to investigate what exactly the properties of the Earth's geomagnetic field were. It's encouraging that this recent article about SWARM not only mentions the phrase Birkeland current several times, but it also talks about electric fields. Now, that's a word that almost never gets mentioned in the establishment literature, but it's getting to be fairly well known that electrical energy does indeed come from the sun to Earth in large tube-like conduits that have over the years become known as Birkeland currents. The establishment usually only talks about magnetic and gravitational fields, but the all-important term electric current usually has been missing. This latest SWARM article makes it appear that the establishment may have been quietly listening to our ideas. Now, of course, they're never going to give us credit for it. They will now claim that they discovered everything, and they will try to ignore the existence of our prior claims. But I think it's our duty to ourselves and actually to posterity to stake out those claims and say exactly what we have said in the past about things like Birkeland currents. I will say that my model, which I hasten to say is an extension of the work of some other folks such as Hannes Alfvén, who won the Nobel Prize in Physics, and Anthony Peratt, and a fellow by the name of Stig Lundquist, who actually started the work on this model back in 1950. That model predicts most, if not all, of what the SWARM release refers to as their discoveries. It makes me a little bit worried about whether they have ever heard of some of the people. Certainly they have never heard of me, but you think they might have heard of Hannes Alfvén and Tony Peratt and, of course, Christian Birkeland. But anyway, in 2015, the scientific journal Progress in Physics published an article of mine in which I included a quantitative derivation of this model. I finished it off. Will Lindquist started it, and I ended up developing the equations that describe the physical structure of a Birkeland current. Those equations must be interpreted to follow up on what those equations predict about what the model must look like. Lundquist, in spite of my giving him credit for coming up with some of those equations, he never, like I guess most mathematicians don't, interpreted what those equations predicted for what the Birkeland current would look like and how it would act. But the model, as I developed it, shows the presence of electrical currents that flow in spiral paths in opposite directions. Those things were in that SWARM article. Oppositely directed currents, yes. And the Birkeland current itself is made up of a set of, and this is, I think, the important point, the Birkeland current is a set of concentric counter-rotating cylinders of electrical current and magnetic fields.
Direct confirmation.
And the currents and the fields are at all points in those Birkeland currents parallel. They're aligned. When you align the currents with the magnetic fields, the internal stresses on the Birkeland current relax and go to zero. And that's the single property that makes those Birkeland currents able to go over tremendous distances. I mean, we know they go from the sun to the Earth, and that's 93 million miles. Well, that's nothing. That's a child's footstep compared to the astronomical distances in light years some of these so-called jets from galaxies extend over. And those currents don't come apart. They don't spread out like a garden hose will end up in a bunch of droplets sprinkling over your lawn. They hang right together in collinear alignment, and that's the reason they do. The formal name for a Birkeland current really is a field-aligned current. It's a force-free current because the fields are aligned. Anyhow, the Swarm article says each satellite has an electric field instrument positioned at the front to measure plasma density, drift, and velocity. Well, if that's indeed the truth, then I would think they should have measured some kind of concentric counter-rotation, because the counter-rotation is the prime property, as far as I'm concerned, of the Birkeland current. But either they haven't observed it, or if they did observe it, they have neglected to mention it, maybe because they don't know why it occurs. It's well known that the Earth has a geomagnetic field. It's less well known, but it's equally true that the Earth and many of the planets also have their own electric field. And the electric field that emanates either to or from Earth is a very powerful electric field. The Earth is, and most of the planets, I think, are also electrically charged. If you sit down and analyze what that phrase means, supersonic plasma jets, plasma is a word that defines a cloud-like collection of charges, plus ions, negative electrons, all going along or traveling along in a cloud-like formation. And a jet is a moving stream. It's a flow. So a flow of charge, well, that's the definition of an electric current. But we already knew this. That's what Birkeland himself, back in the early 1900s, said was going on. That's what they laughed at him for saying.
For continuous updates on space news from the electric universe, stay tuned to thunderbolts.info.
Some jackasses are still laughing, thinking that the standard model is the dogma model.
Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. In part one of this presentation, physicist Wal Thornhill began laying the foundations for a new theoretical understanding of our sun and all stars. Standard theory remains that stars are born due to the gravitational collapse of material in nebular clouds over vast spans of time. We're told that stars die when they inevitably exhaust their fuel or simply explode. But for many years, countless discoveries have contradicted these fundamental concepts. In this episode, Thornhill further explores the electric universe predictions and explanations for a variety of stellar phenomena.
So let's return to the declaration of our esteemed internet lecturer that our sun was born about 5 billion years ago. There is no evidence whatsoever for this categorical statement. With the thermonuclear model discredited by the observational evidence, the complex life story of stars is exposed as fiction. 2 recent reports support this judgment out of a countless number of others expressing surprise at unexpected discoveries. On March 6th, phys.org headlined a report, "Star Clusters Discovery Could Upset the Astronomical Apple Cart." It begins, "The discovery of young stars in old clusters could send scientists back to the drawing board, because models of stellar evolution are based on the assumption that stars within star clusters form from the same material at roughly the same time. However, back to the drawing board always means embroidering the set of beliefs permanently inscribed on the board. No physicist shows the intellectual integrity to wipe the board clean of its unscientific Big Bang myth and start afresh. It's all too hard and scary." So Dr. Kenji Becky from the International Center for Radio Astronomy Research says, "The formation of these younger stars could have been fueled by gas entering the clusters from interstellar space. However, observations showed that there was no correlation between interstellar hydrogen gas and the location of the clusters we were studying. We believe the younger stars have actually been created out of the matter ejected from older stars as they die, which means we have discovered multiple generations of stars belonging to the same cluster. The words "we believe" are accurate. The discovery of multiple generations of stars is not. The notion of the age of a star is based on plotting a point on the Hertzsprung-Russell diagram where the star leaves the main sequence after the exhaustion of its main fuel. But we have shown that stars do not exhaust their fuel any more than an electric light does. Stars don't die because their fuel runs out or mysteriously explodes. The Hertzsprung-Russell diagram is simply a plot of points and not an evolutionary sequence. Stars have been observed to change swiftly and inexplicably from one location to another on the diagram. When viewed correctly as a mirror image, the diagram represents the change in color and brightness of a star as the electrical energy focused on it increases along the x-axis. Sharp discontinuities exist in experimental gas discharges between dark mode, glow mode, and arc mode. These discontinuities simply explain the sharply different appearances of faint white dwarfs, bright sun-like stars, and red so-called dwarfs and red giant stars. The red color is due to an extensive anode glow, and the faint white color is simply a coronal glow of a normally constituted stellar body lacking a bright arc mode photosphere. No imaginary ultra-dense dwarf object is required. There is no need to invent an ad hoc requirement for stars to have exploded and then somehow gather their widely scattering dust gravitationally to give birth to younger stars in the cluster. Stellar explosions are often invoked to clear dust and gas from star clusters. Astronomers can't have it both ways, but critically, none of this complicated ad hocery fits the observations of filamentary star birth inside molecular clouds. The second report appeared on May 18th last year in phys.org, titled "Stellar Mystery Deepens." A Monash University-led research team made an unexpected discovery that a large group of stars are dying prematurely, challenging our accepted view of stellar evolution. Their results revealed that large numbers of helium-burning stars are dying prematurely in the M4 globular cluster. Professor Lattanzio from the Max Planck Institute for Astrophysics said, "Globular clusters are some of the oldest objects in the universe. Although we have some ideas for what is going on in them, every time we look carefully, we find something unexpected. They are both fascinating and frustrating at the same time." The international team found that about half of the stars tend to skip the red giant phase, instead becoming white dwarfs millions of years ahead of schedule. Demonstrating once again what's wrong with the modern scientific method, characterized as "shut up and simulate," Professor Lattanzio continued, "Computer simulations do not agree with this observation. So, as well as continuing observations, new computer models will need to be generated to better understand what is taking place in the cores of these stars. But the computer models are built on missing or invalid concepts. There's nothing going on in the cores of stars, and globular clusters are not understood. So the mathematical computer simulations produce a virtual, unreal cosmos that, like the movies, can be programmed to produce anything you can imagine. And the artist's impressions we see in science reports are little more than glossy advertising material, but much more deceptive because it is falsely labelled real science. There is no real mystery here. With no nuclear fire inside, stars don't die by bloating to a red giant and collapsing to a white dwarf as their fire goes out. The life and death stories of stars are fictional. The bloated appearance of red giants is not due to internal pressure caused by hypothetical helium burning at 100 million degrees in the core of a star. It is a purely electrical effect witnessed in laboratory low-pressure gas discharge tubes. Red stars are those that satisfy their need for electrons from the surrounding plasma by expanding the surface area over which they collect electrons by growing a large plasma sheath that becomes the effective anode in space. The growth process is self-limiting because as the sheath expands, its electric field grows stronger. Electrons caught up in the field are accelerated until they become energetic enough to excite neutral particles they chance to collide with, and the huge sheath becomes a uniform red anode glow. It becomes a red giant star. The electric field driving this process will also give rise to a massive flow of positive ions away from the star, or in more conventional terms, a prodigious stellar wind. Such loss of matter is a characteristic feature of red giants. Standard stellar theory is at a loss to explain this, since the star is said to be too cold to boil off a stellar wind. Arthur Eddington himself expressed his puzzlement about white dwarfs. Strange objects which persist in showing a type of spectrum entirely out of keeping with their luminosity may ultimately teach us more than a host which radiates according to rule. He was right. A white dwarf appears extremely hot, white, and underluminous because it is a faint white coronal discharge. As usual, a thin plasma sheath will be formed between the plasma of the star and the plasma of space. The electric field across the plasma sheath is capable of accelerating electrons to generate ultraviolet light and X-rays when they hit atoms in the atmosphere, and the power dissipated is capable of raising the temperature of a thin plasma layer to tens of thousands of degrees. The spectral lines are broadened, sometimes to the point of disappearance, due to the coronal electric field. This gives the misleading impression that hydrogen, whose spectral lines are smeared the most, is missing in many of these stars, and that therefore they are remnants of larger stars that have conventionally lost or burned their hydrogen fuel. So, globular clusters are not some of the oldest objects in the universe. Their spherical shape of a dense collection of stars and their elliptical orbits about the galactic center hint at a quasar-style birth process from the plasmoid at the heart of the galaxy. If so, the electromagnetic environment inside the globular cluster is different to that in open clusters of stars, so we should expect an unusual distribution of white dwarfs and red giant stars. And the puzzling observation that some globular cluster stars have 100 times more iron than others could also be explained by electromagnetic sorting of elements within the globular cluster at its birth. The fact we don't understand stars in the 21st century highlights what Arthur Koestler wrote in The Sleepwalkers. The history of cosmic theories in particular may without exaggeration be called a history of collective obsessions and controlled schizophrenia, and the manner in which some of the most important individual discoveries were arrived at reminds one more of a sleepwalker's performance than an electronic brain's. Science is still in its childhood, and we behave as infants. We give far too much credit to scientists for knowing what they are talking about.
For continuous updates on space news from the Electric Universe, welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. In part one of this presentation, Dr. Michael Claridge, a scientist on the Sapphire Project team, began his analysis of a recent landmark discovery, which shows a surprising relationship between sunspots and solar flares. As Dr. Claridge explained, the discovery that solar flares seem to have a powerful influence on sunspots is highly problematic for standard solar theory. In this episode, Dr. Claridge explores what may be the fundamental difference between the standard and electric universe concepts of the sun. And that is, in an electric universe, stars are not the isolated bodies envisioned in standard theory.
Scientific thought exists in layers, or levels. At the top, we have theories. Below that, we have scientific models. And below that, we have data. I have stacked them vertically because these three aspects, theory, models, and data, are not of equal weight or equal power. Scientific theories, the top level, are what you might call big ideas. They set the overall framework for years of work where many scientists can create many models and do lots of experiments collecting lots of data. Scientific theories change very slowly, over centuries. The models change more quickly, and new data, it's coming in every day. I'm going to talk through some reasons why this new sunspot data is so important for our understanding of scientific theories and models. Current theory, and I want you to notice that I'm using the word theory, which is the highest level of my diagram, says that each star in our great universe is isolated from every other star. Yes, you may not know that about mainstream cosmology, but mainstream cosmology assumes that every star in our galaxy is isolated from every other star. Like our picture of a medieval lord, each isolated star creates its own energy only from within itself. But if you entertain the idea that stars might be energetically connected to each other, if you entertain the idea that stars might receive energy from the galaxy of which they are a part, just as cells in our own bodies receive sustenance from our bodies as a whole, then we have in our hands a very different scientific theory. We are at a point in cosmology where there are two worldviews. The old worldview, as I mentioned, sees all stars as energetically isolated. The new worldview says that stars are energetically connected and can influence each other. The new worldview goes further to acknowledge different levels of energies. There are energies that exist at planetary levels, like weather, lightning, and the northern lights. And then there are energies that operate at the scale of stars, solar flares, the solar wind, and the heliospheric current sheet. But there's also energies that operate at the level of galaxies. And all these levels are connected. In the new worldview, the planets receive solar energies and transform those or scale them down so that lightning and weather on our planet are manifestations of what happens when a planet absorbs and digests solar energies. And just as a planet would be blown to smithereens if it were hit by the full power of a star, so would a single star be blown to bits if it were to ever receive the full energy of a galaxy. But individual stars can absorb and digest their small portion of these galactic energies. The stellar activities of solar flares and sunspots and the solar wind are what happens when stars take in their small portion of galactic energies. Asked if there is any data that might support such a new worldview, I can only say that much of the evidence has already been seen, but we have not known how to understand what we are seeing. We scoff at people several hundred years ago who thought the Earth was the center of all things. For a few hundred years now, we have been thinking in terms of the sun being the center of all things. So how are we really any better? It is time now to add another and larger level to our cosmology and truly see that stars are part of a larger, a more energetic world. Look, for example, at this wonderful image from the Herschel telescope. We can see clearly that stars form on filaments, galactic filaments. I can tell you that none of the models of the old worldview predicted that. In fact, such a result would have been impossible. Here's a situation similar to Chang Liu's paper. The old theories not only did not predict that stars would form this way, the old theories said it was impossible. Yet in the new cosmology that I'm trying to describe, this result of stars forming on threads was predicted by such theorists as Wal Thornhill long before the images started coming back from the Herschel telescope. He was able to predict exactly what the new telescopes show us because he was starting from a very different theory of how galaxies and stars are related. This infrared data from Herschel is just one example. Fresh images and data are coming in every day of our Earth, of other planets, the solar system, and the planets that orbit other stars. when the recent results were published that a nearby star has 7 planets orbiting it, all of which might harbor life, I asked my students, are you surprised that we are discovering that most stars have planets orbiting them? And the vast majority of my students said no. They were not surprised at all. I was very encouraged by this because it shows that they have an inherent sense that these sorts of hierarchies are to be expected. Our solar system is not unusual or any sort of exception. And I encourage anyone out there to start looking at the wealth of the new data from NASA, ESA, and other agencies. Look at the data from the point of view of a new cosmology.
For continuous updates on space news from the electric universe, stay tuned to thunderbolts.info. Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. In part 1 of this presentation, author Ted Holden explored the evidence for fundamental differences in our world's environment since a time when dinosaurs walked the Earth. In Holden's analysis, the most obvious explanation for the enormous size of the largest dinosaurs is that Earth's gravity was once considerably weaker. But the mysteries don't end there. While the Thunderbolts Project takes no position on these issues, in this episode, Holden continues his analysis and explores perhaps the most controversial question of all. Is it possible that dinosaurs existed on Earth far more recently than institutional science has ever considered?
Aside from the various problems I may have mentioned in that first interview involving dinosaurs and flying creatures and things whose ability to function depends on something which involves a squared figure, whereas weight is always proportional to volume, which is the cubed figure. In the case of size and strength, as you double your dimensions, you cut your power-to-weight ratio in half. You can only cut your power-to-weight ratio in half so many times still stand up and function right. You've got a problem with the large dinosaurs, aside from just standing up, you've got a problem with what to do with their necks, right? Because as I mentioned previously, if they held their necks upwards, they wouldn't be able to get blood to their brains, right? I mean, it would take a heart bigger than their body would hold just to get blood pressure enough to function, right? So that you've got people nowadays trying to believe that all dinosaurs held their necks outwards, but a large dinosaur holding his neck outward would have an even bigger problem than that. In other words, something like a seismosaur, whose neck could easily be 50 feet long, right? Could easily weigh 40, 50, 60,000 pounds. If you've got a neck which is even 40,000 pounds, and if the center of gravity of that neck is even 10 feet out from the shoulders, then you're looking at 400,000 foot-pounds of torque. And you're probably looking at more like 500,000, a bit more than 500,000 foot-pounds of torque for a number of these animals if they were to hold their necks outwards. Now, what exactly is like 500,000 foot-pounds of torque ballpark for? Well, I mean, that's ballpark for the combined maximum torque of all 4 of the engines of an Iowa-class battleship. That is enough torque to drive a 60,000-ton ship through the water at 33 knots. That's the dilemma. A sauropod dinosaur in our world would have no way to hold his neck. He couldn't hold his neck upwards because of the blood pressure problem. and he couldn't hold his neck outwards because of the torque problem. You've got a couple of other comments on that first video. Some of these I've seen over and over again. You've got a claim that, well, maybe the air was simply more dense in those days, or you had an atmosphere which was close to being buoyant, and maybe that accounted for some of these problems. The answer is not really. I mean, number one, you've still got to breathe that air, right? I mean, air which was close to being buoyant would simply burn up anything trying to breathe it. It would be like the redneck physics experiment where you get the guys trying to pour a pail of liquid oxygen onto a barbecue. That looks sort of like the napalm bomb scenes, from Victory at Sea. And that's what would be going on inside the cells of your body if you were to sit there and try to breathe an atmosphere that was that thick. That's number one. Number two says that, like, even in the case of a 40-pound pterosaur, like the pterodactyl, the pteranodon, in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, that was the biggest flying dinosaur that anybody knew anything about, right? And they assumed that somewhere around 40 pounds was the largest creature that could possibly even glide, much less fly. Is that even just holding his wings in a turn would snap the wing bones if he was any bigger than that. Just in our normal atmosphere, enough to make the atmosphere close to being buoyant, and that problem becomes worse, not better. You've got problems which I think would just eliminate this idea of a vastly thicker atmosphere straight off the bat. The only thing that really helps the situation is reduced gravity. You've also got a question of people wanting to talk about expanding Earth theories. And I mentioned that I do not believe in Earth expanding theories. Why not, right? Well, there's a couple of reasons. Why would anybody want to believe in an expanding Earth theory? There's two reasons. One is dinosaurs. Once you realize that a large dinosaur could not exist in our present gravity, then the simplest way to try to account for reduced gravity in ancient times would be to try to talk about the Earth simply expanding its mass, right? Maybe the Earth just was nowhere near as big in ancient times. You've got people making this claim, and they assume that you've got 65 million years to account for this increase in mass going from the world of the dinosaurs to our present age. It turns out that that's not really believable. It's like those 65 million years have gone away. Somewhere around 2006, you started getting soft tissue turning up in dinosaur remains. It started with this Mary Schweitzer at North Carolina State University, who was working with a bunch of tyrannosaur bones. They had one very large femur bone, which was intact. They cut it in half, right? They figured glue it back together once they got it back to the university. But once they cut this thing in half, they were able to see that there was soft tissue remaining in this bone, that they've gotten more and more soft tissue starting from that time, not just in the one bone, right, but in a number of dinosaur remains involving hadrosaurs, involving like the Triceratops, involving several other kinds of dinosaurs, right? And, there's nowhere in the world that soft tissue is going to survive for 65 million years. Okay, they've actually started to get good radiocarbon dates for some of the soft tissue. In several cases, they've gotten radiocarbon dates of 20 to 40,000 years. So that you've got several data points like this. You've got radiocarbon datings for dinosaur remains. You've got good representations of known dinosaur types on canyon walls around North America. And the most common of the dinosaur petroglyphs is the stegosaur, which Native Americans called Mishi Pishu, which means water panther. You've got like a number of those which still exist. You've got a large animal that holds his legs underneath his body, which means that he's not a crocodile or anything like that, right? He's got dorsal spikes at the stegosaur. Now, Vine Deloria told me he'd been doing a compendium of Indian oral traditions. He'd been up and down the American continent speaking to every storyteller, every keeper of oral traditions, all the way from Alaska down to Tierra del Fuego, right? And he said if there was anything that sort of flummoxed him at first, it was the extent to which almost every one of these tribes retained oral traditions about, Indian ancestors having to deal with dinosaurs. He said that the name Mishi Pishu means water panther. It's a name similar to the word Mississippi, that Indian oral traditions described this water panther, they call him a water panther, Mishi Pishu, as having like red fur, a cat-like face, a saw-blade back, and a great spiked tail, which he used as a weapon. Okay, Lewis and Clark had said that their native guides were in mortal terror at the sight of these glyphs around the Mississippi River, because the original intention of these glyphs was caution. You know, one of these things lives here. What I believe to be the case, Stegosaur was not the largest dinosaur, but he still had gravity problems, right? It was like, I believe that the Stegosaur moved into water after the change in gravity simply to deal with this increasing weight, but that he didn't have any real adaptation to living in water. He eventually died out, you know, the bull sharks got him or something else like that died, you know. At the Kachina Bridge in Natural Bridges, Utah, you've got a sauropod glyph, which looks like this. But the evolutionists that are saying, well, this is just a snake, obviously, and these four legs are just smudges. No snake ever coiled itself into a configuration like that. That's a dinosaur.
For continuous updates on space news from the electric universe, stay tuned to thunderbolts.info. Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. New reports in popular science media highlight some of the theoretical limitations in planetary science and geology today, limitations which have resulted in countless mysteries related to planets, moons, and comets. The reports in question propose that volcanism on various bodies throughout the solar system is more pervasive than scientists have ever previously believed, even supposedly occurring on comets. On March 6, 2017, Astronomy.com published the article, Planet...
All right, everybody. I appreciate you guys hanging out with me for this hour, however long it's been. But I've got to run. I've got a few things I got to take care of. So once again, we'll see you next time. Probably do this again in the next day or two or whatever. I usually don't, advertise that I'm gonna do it or whatever. So stay tuned. Keep checking back with me. Thanks, guys. Thanks everybody in the chat for helping out the new people and all that stuff. And we'll catch you guys in a little while. All right, take care.